Here is the question. The Okay, there's 25 of participants, 26 actually, and I think we can officially start right now. Welcome again. Hello to everybody. Welcome on our event, Coffee with today as well. I think this is 5th edition of our event doing online in a time of crisis. And I'm wishing a warmly welcome to our today guest, Mr. Peter van der Auweret, the Chief of IOM Mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina and also regional coordinator for the Western Balkans. Thank you so much for your time, and it is a pleasure having you here on this event.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe we can actually start with asking you and your opinion. What do you think about the whole of this situation with the pandemic, and how are you personally dealing with it, and how did it actually affect the whole situation in the IOM stuff?
For me personally, the main issue is that my children are in Brussels and I can't go and see them. Beyond that, my life here is pretty much as normal because I'm not working from home. I'm actually in the office, and that relates directly to what IOM does here. As you probably know, or most of the participants know, we are running most of the migrant accommodation centers here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So while some agencies or some organizations can work from home, I have about 250 staff, which by the way are 99% people from Bosnia and Herzegovina, working every day with the migrants in those centers. So of course I'm also out and about working, visiting the centers, visiting my staff, managing the problems that arise. What has been, of course, a big impact for the work that we do is all the measures that we have had to put in place in the migrant centers for COVID-19. We worked together with a partner, the Danish Refugee Council, who works on the health component. We had to create isolation zones in those centers for migrants that are arriving because they have to go in isolation, just like anyone who arrives in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Luckily we already had quarantine zones because many times when people come to the migrant centers, they have scabies, which is a skin disease. And actually when the crisis started, I think the largest number of quarantine spaces were actually inside the migrant centers. So we transformed those into zones for people with COVID-like symptoms. And as part of the response also, we had to make sure that the migrants understood what is Corona, what are the measures that the authorities here in Bosnia and Herzegovina put in place, what is the situation in their home country. So there is a lot of efforts being put into providing information to the migrants. And then, in addition to that, we had to find a solution together with the authorities for the migrants that were staying outside those centers. Because as you probably are aware, one of the big challenges in Bosnia and Herzegovina has been over the past 2 years that we've always had about 1,500 to 2,000 migrants sleeping in abandoned buildings. Now, that was never a good idea in the best of circumstances, but now, of course, with Corona, there are two issues. On the one hand, these people don't have access to health services, so they are not being tested by anyone. So they may get ill and may not actually have access to a doctor, but it's a problem for the local population, for example, in Bihać, who doesn't know when migrants are in the streets. Are there people that have been tested for Corona, or they may be ill? So we needed to find a solution for that urgently. And so we established additional 1,000 beds here in the center that we have in Canton Sarajevo, in Blažu, where all the people that were sleeping in squats in Sarajevo were brought over the past couple of weeks. And we also established, you probably saw that in the news just now, a new tent camp in Unasana Canton, which is for about 1,000 people who are sleeping outside in squats in Bihać. So that has created a lot of work because we had to do that in the context where there are restrictions in terms of trade. Companies cannot necessarily operate. It's difficult to import goods into the country. So that's been quite a bit of a challenge. One of the challenges also for my staff, I think, is that migrants are not allowed to leave the centers. So while in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for people from here, it's only people under 18 and above 65 that have to stay indoors. Migrants have to stay inside those centers. Now, we have 80% of the migrants are young males between, I would say, 17 and 35, 40 years old. Keeping people in those centers, of course, creates tensions. You have different national groups. People come to Bosnia-Herzegovina not to be here, but they want to continue their journey to Croatia, to Slovenia, to Italy. And that's becoming increasingly difficult to manage. You maybe saw in the news that we had some security incidents in Blaju. We had a big fight with 200-300 migrants involved. We had an issue in a center in Unasana canton. And this is not necessarily because migrants are somehow inherently bad people. A small minority, of course, are like in any group, are troublemakers, but it's also related to the tension that you have. And we try to manage this by, for example, making sure that migrants have access to shops. We have shops that come to the centers, because one of the issues is, for example, if you're a smoker, like myself, if you need cigarettes, so if you cannot go to a shop, how are you going to get the cigarettes? So we have now shops that are coming to the centers. We also have organized that migrants have access to their money to Western Union. It's something we set up, but the basic problem that migrants cannot move is posing as a challenge. Sorry. So the one challenge, the final challenge, is that we still have a lot of migrants sleeping outside, specifically in Velika Kladuša, and for that we unfortunately don't really have solutions. So that's in a nutshell, I think, what COVID-19 has meant for IOM. And of course, as a final thing, one of the concerns that I have also as being responsible for my team is the health situation of the staff, because people go out every day in those centers, are exposed to migrants, or exposed to other colleagues. So we also put in a lot of measures in place, regular medical testing, access to masks, to gloves, and so on. But of course, also there is the psychological stress on my staff, because they go back home to their families in the evening, and they're worried that maybe they caught coronavirus during the day and they will infect their family. So we also try to provide psychological support for our own staff who has to deal with their own anxieties about this corona situation.
Sure. Before the whole situation with the corona started here as a crisis, and it is kind of presented and represented as certainly as a crisis. We had in the medias and out in public here in Bosnia and Herzegovina migration or migrant crisis all the time. Like everybody's were talking about it. So what do you think after all of this actually ends with COVID-19, which all of us is actually hoping that it will end soon? What do you think? Is this crisis going to affect us on a more positive or on a more negative way? If we are relating this question and issue toward our relation to those people that are actually kind of suffering and having the troubles on their road?
Well, I think, first, look, in the past 2 years or so, we've had about 60,000 migrants that have come to Bosnia-Herzegovina. Why were they coming? They were not coming for Bosnia-Herzegovina. They were coming because they were stuck in Greece, difficult situation there, and they used this route to get to other parts of the European Union. So essentially, Bosnia-Herzegovina was a pure transit country, and you couldn't see that when you look at the numbers. Today, I would say we have about 7,500, 8,000 migrants inside Bosnia-Herzegovina. We had 60,000 that have arrived since January 2018. So you can see that 52,000 people came and left, and they are now somewhere else inside the European Union. This was a new phenomenon for Bosnia-Herzegovina. Bosnia-Herzegovina, when you go to Unasana canton, they never had seen Pakistani people or Afghani people suddenly in their hundreds walking the street. And I think that I certainly understand that posed a lot of anxiety and concern amongst the local population. Then on top of that, as is often in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the response of the state to what do you need to do when you have transit migration. In essence, you need to make sure that while people are on your territory, they are accommodated in official centers where they have access to food, access to health, access to other services that they may need. That's not just an issue you're not just doing this for the migrants. You're also doing this to protect your own population, because if you don't have that, you have what we had all along the crisis, which is that migrants are begging in the street, they're sleeping in the park, they're sleeping in squats. They are not, as I said earlier in this context of Corona, they're not medically checked. So that is really important to do that. Well, it took a lot of time and we've been lurching from crisis to crisis, always running behind the numbers in terms of having sufficient accommodation available. Additional problem was that you have a high concentration of migrants in Una-Sana canton. Why there? Because Slovenia is very close by, and Slovenia is the first Schengen country, which is why migrants go there. So the cities of Bihać and Velika Kladuša really have been problematic. Now, often, people present Bosnia and Herzegovina in a negative light on this, and I think that we have to be a little bit more careful on how we judge. First of all, the beauty of what has happened, if I can put it in those maybe a bit strange terms, is that for me, what I have seen, by and large, when we had the crisis here in Sarajevo, in Una-Sana canton, whether people were Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, poor, middle class, rich people, by and large, I have seen a lot of solidarity, or at least understanding, and very little anti-migrant sentiments. Listen, if Bihać is a small city, I think about 30,000 people. If in a similar town in Germany or in Belgium, something like this would have happened, we would have had extreme right-wing anti-migrant protests after 6 months, give and take. In Bihać, they organized an anti-migrant protest in the summer of last year. There were 300 people, which shows that even though some of those people are very vocal and loud on Facebook, and you may think that there is this huge group of anti-migrant people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the reality is very different. So the beautiful part of the story is that I think the media has generated the sense of a crisis to a certain degree. The crisis has been caused by a lack of response and being too slow in putting these centers up, because there is also the mistaken belief among some people that if you have more centers, you have more migrants. That is not true. Migrants are not coming here. Whatever you do in Bosnia, you can reduce the number of migrants by increasing border control, but they will continue to come as long as they can continue to go to Croatia, Slovenia, and the European Union. After the crisis, currently, the number of people coming to Bosnia has almost dropped to zero. We have about 10, 15, 20 people per week arriving. Before the Corona crisis, we had about 700 a week. My sense is that once Corona is done, we will continue. We will see an increase in the number of people arriving, but also an increase in the number of people departing. So I don't think that there is going to be a huge change of the situation on the ground. Yes, more people come, but more people will continue to depart, would be my prediction of what is going to happen in the future. On that last point, what is quite interesting in the last couple of days, what I have seen in Una-Sana canton, is that more people are actually leaving to Croatia now. I'm not sure whether that is going to continue. Also, we have to see how many people will be pushed back eventually by Croatia into Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is also happening regularly. But it seems that maybe it's easier now for people to cross through the last couple of days than it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, which may mean that the number of migrants in Bosnia-Herzegovina will go down. But let's see what will happen in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. Now, actually, I'm thinking about the whole this situation and maybe one practical example and practical kind of question. So if we imagine the situation that, for example, I'm the migrant that crosses the border illegally in Bosnia and Herzegovina and actually was caught by the police somewhere on the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, maybe you can provide us answer, what is the procedure and what is the situation, what's going on with me if I'm maybe caught somewhere out on the street. So what's going after, and what is the future of the people that are in our country illegally?
Sure. So what happens, let's say that you get caught by the police. Then the first question that the police will ask is whether you are registered here in Bosnia-Herzegovina or not. Most people are not. Then what will happen is that the Service for Foreigners will register you, and you will register with something that is called, you will say that you have the intention to seek asylum in Bosnia-Herzegovina. On the basis of that, you are given a white paper, which in normal circumstances will give you the freedom of movement in Bosnia-Herzegovina for 15 days. Within those 15 days, you have to, in principle, ask for asylum in Bosnia-Herzegovina with the asylum services. Now, currently, when the police catches you, you will be registered. You will get that white paper, but you will no longer have the freedom of movement. You will be brought to a center. Let's say if you're in Sarajevo, you will be brought to Blažu, where you will then be registered in the center, and you will stay there for the time being, as long as these movement restrictions are in place. Now, there are 2 or 3 different scenarios. Some people actually then do decide to apply for asylum. They will file an asylum claim, there is an interview, and then the asylum services will see whether you are a refugee under the 1951 Convention, and eventually gives you a positive or a negative answer. Now that process is very, very slow. That can take months or even years if there would be a high number of people. People who don't do that, usually they get their 15-day paper renewed. So they go back to the SFA and they get another 15-day document. Now, what I think will happen, in Una-Sana canton, the freedom of movement is limited, so people have to stay in the center, except if they want to go to Croatia. So people are still allowed to leave for Croatia, but it has to be very clear that people should then go what the migrants call the game. So they cannot just leave the center and go and have a cigarette or whatever in Bijec. They have to actually move towards the Croatian border. In Sarajevo currently, of course, there is no border to go to, so they're stuck here. And the only thing that they could do is to try to go to Una-Sana canton, but that is not allowed. What I think will happen after the measures for the crisis will be, and that's not for me to say, it will be the state, the authorities that will decide. I would believe that the ban on movement will be abolished, and migrants will start moving from Sarajevo to Una-Sana canton and subsequently to Croatia and Slovenia and onwards. Because once the corona situation is over, there are no legal grounds in Bosnia-Herzegovina to limit the freedom of movement for people that have this white paper. Now, if they don't have a white paper and they're not registered, or their white paper expires, under the law of foreigners, what should then happen is that those migrants should be arrested and placed into close detention and be returned to their home country. Now that's where you get into, well, that's the legal answer. That's where you get into a reality check. Let's play this through. Let's say that we have 3,000 or 2,500 Pakistanis. Let's just use that nationality for the example. Let's say that 2,000 people have their white paper expired. Well, then you would have to have a closed detention center where you put 2,000 people, which Bosnia-Herzegovina does not have. There is a closed detention center here in Sarajevo, capacity of about 100. But secondly, then you have to have Pakistan accept those people back. Now, what is the problem? The problem is that most people, rightly or wrongly, say that they don't have a document. They don't have a passport. So the Pakistani embassy will have to agree that Peter is actually a Pakistani. Now, that requires a whole process. That doesn't happen overnight. So you can imagine for 2,000 people, how long that would take. In the meantime, let's not forget, these people need to stay in close detention. This can take years. So that component of the migration management, this idea that you arrest people who no longer have that 15-day document and return them home, doesn't really work. Also, because there is a political problem. I don't know to what extent the participants follow what is happening within the EU. Even Germany, use that as an example, finds it difficult to return people, let's say, for example, to Algeria. People that have gone through the asylum process, got a negative decision, in principle, they can be removed. Legally, from a human rights perspective, no problem. But Algeria needs to agree. Now, even with the political leverage and the political power that Germany has and the international aid that Germany gives, they find it difficult to have countries of origin collaborate with forced returns. So you can imagine if Bosnia-Herzegovina goes to Islamabad in Pakistan and says, hello, we have 2,000 Pakistanis, what will happen, and I'm sorry to be so blunt, is they will take a list and they say, here is the countries that have provided assistance to Pakistan. And where is Bosnia-Herzegovina? Well, probably nowhere. So the political leverage of Bosnia to force, if I can put it in those terms, countries of origin to take their people back is quite limited. So that is why that part of when people say, oh, we have to return all of them, okay, fine. There is no, if people have had the opportunity to file for an asylum claim, if they, for whatever reason, don't do it, and overstay the period of 15 days, from a legal perspective or a human rights perspective, no problem to return these people. The problem is, how can you do that operationally? IOM runs a program that is called Voluntary Return. We have returned in the last 2 years about 1,200 people from Bosnia-Herzegovina, but that is on a voluntary basis. So we have Pakistanis, to use that example, who come to us and say, listen, we don't want to continue our journey, we want to go back home. In that case, we can help them to get travel documents, we pay for their flight ticket back, they get a small reintegration grant, we have staff that will receive them back in Pakistan, brings them to their home. So that is a service that is available to the migrants, but that is on a voluntary basis. And so that, of course, is only for the people who decide that they don't want to stay here, they don't want to continue their journey to Croatia, maybe they run out of money, whatever it is, and they go back. So that's, in a nutshell, I think, I hope, an answer to your question.
For sure, thank you. It was quite detailed the answer, and I think that a lot of us in this group actually now could have get a kind of clear picture of how it actually looks being in our country, caught or stuck, whatever we say. Regarding all of these issues that are affecting all of us, few days ago there is a information and kind of initiative and not so good picture and situation in one of the villages near to Bosanski Petrovac, where there is a kind of shelter built or in that phase of building, and the domestic population is actually protesting against that. So how would you actually describe it? Is this some kind of clear example of maybe political manipulation or a humanitarian question or issue, or how should we consider that issue on a more objective way?
Listen, I mean, I think that I'll come to the specific issue of Lipa, which is what you're referring to, but I'll start with the example of Blažu, this big center that we have in Sarajevo, in the canton, because there is a village nearby, the village of Blažu. So when the center, when it's a former military barracks from the former Yugoslav army, and so when the decision was made by the authorities to use that as a migrant center, the community was very concerned. I fully understand. You are living in a community, Blažu is quite small, you're going to get 2,000 single males in the center. Frankly, if I would be in that community, I would be also asking questions why this is in my community. Now, how do you deal with that? First, I think you deal with that the way we dealt with it, together with the mayor of Ilija in this case. You talk to people, you inform people what is going to happen, what are the security measures that you're putting in place. You also try to have the community benefit from the center. For example, in Blažu, there are a lot of long-term unemployed people. We gave them priority, if they had the right skills, to work for us as cleaning people, maintenance people, migrant assistants. So you create a stake of the community in the center. It's very important to do that. Not just, and it's not because then, you know, cynical people will say, oh, you're buying people off. Well, but tell that to the people that haven't had a job for 10 years and now actually have a decent salary. So I get quite angry when you know, on Facebook I read people, yeah, you buy people off with a job. Okay, fine. That's nice to say for someone like me when I have a job. But also, these people will understand what goes on in the centers and will become ambassadors in their own community. They will explain to people what is happening. Then also try to have local populations speak to the migrants. Also do work with the migrants to say you are guests here, and you have to respect local communities. And I'll give you a very nice example of how the dynamics can change. We had a school director. There is a school nearby this Blaju Center who said before the center opened, I need additional police protection in front of the school because these migrants, So the police, local police said, okay, we'll do it. After 3 days, he came to see the mayor of Velija and said, please, I really don't need it. I've seen these guys walking by. There is no problem at all. So you can see with communication and with getting the local community engaged, you can deal with some of those anxieties. And the police needs to do its job. I was very upset in the beginning in Unasana Canton when there were crimes committed by migrants, and some police or some judges were refusing to take those cases because they said people don't have documents. Well, in Bosnian criminal law, that's not required. If I kill a person, it didn't happen, well, a migrant killed another migrant, but if you have something like that, I don't need to have a passport to be put in jail in Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's just laziness. So the police needs to do its job so that there is not the perception that migrants can commit crimes. So that is part also of how you deal with that. Now, when it comes to Lipa, this famous camp in Bihać, I don't want to sound disrespectful, but there is no local population around Lipa. It's in the middle of nowhere. And actually, one of the concerns that we had when this was being proposed was that there is nobody there. There is no, it's accessible with 2 sand roads, and it's behind a hill. You can just see it from the main road, but there is really no living population there. There is one small church next to it, which we will put a fence around to make sure that it's protected. We have security on site, the police is on site, but there is no local population that is immediately affected by it. There is Petrovac, and actually the mayor of Petrovac, after initial resistance, said that actually he's now in favor. Also because we employed some vulnerable people from people that didn't have jobs from Petrovac in the camp. But it's that Lipa, for me, the protest is more political, I would say, than a genuine concern of the population. For example, in Blaju, it was different. You really had a genuine concern because there's a real community living next to it. Here, there is no community that is affected by it because the nearest village or settlement is 10 or 15 kilometers away. So it's, you know, migration is always politically used by different sides to make different points. And one of the things that has been interesting, if I can put it in those terms, is working on migration crisis in Unasana Canton and elsewhere. It has given me a lot of insights into how local politics in Bosnia-Herzegovina works. It's exciting.
At least something positive out of all of that experience that you have and still gaining in this country. We're actually kind of on a half of our way of our today's event, so I would give the floor to our participants. I already have 2 of them here with some serious questions, as this is a serious issue and topic that we're discussing about right here. So I would invite Daniel right now to jump in the conversation and to address with his question.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Hello, Mr. Peter. I'm glad to meet you in this online area, in this COVID-19 situation, which is being quite hard for every single of us. I have a few questions, and I'm sorry if it feels a little bit like I'm grilling you here with the questions, but let's start and see where we go. So I'm interested in seeing your opinion and your personal and as well as your organization about the statements and campaign that has been launched by Minister of Security, Mr. Radonjic, in terms that he's saying that he will forcibly return over 10,000 people, that he is creating some kind of list, that he is going to make Pakistani ambassador persona non grande, that he will I don't even know what he's saying anymore. We have you know, as well as you know, that with this COVID-19 situation, that we have a huge problem with SFA, the Service Foreigners Affairs, that they are not working anymore, that not a single new person can register to get their white paper, that no one can access the sector for asylum to get their interview. Before this COVID situation started, they had to wait for so long to get that first interview in a sector for asylum. And we know that that is in the law, it says that it should be happen in the first few days, and they are waiting for 4 or 5 months for it. So of course their 15 days period will expire in the meantime. They cannot anymore they cannot renew the paper anymore. That's also the problem. And so the situation is quite stressful. I'm right now in daily center for young people on the move. We have people here in Tuzla who are taking showers that haven't showered for 3-4 weeks now. So I just going to have to check one guy that is finishing showers. He wants to leave. But this kind of situations for me very it's making me concerned about these people, because I don't think that if they cannot access the asylum process, how are they going, and they have the right to access the asylum process. You can say it's negative or positive solution at the end, but you have to go through the process. You cannot put something in front and say, okay, you don't have a right because you're Pakistani. Because a refugee can also be for many reasons, private reasons, social reasons as well. It can be politically attacked in their country of origin. They can be based on their social group that they are belonging, that they can be attacked and at risk. So it's a very it's very irresponsible from the minister to put this kind of statement. So I'm just wondering, what is it I am going to respond to this kind of because what I'm feeling right now in the public media area, in the public communication area, is that you big organizations, international organizations such as IOM, DRC, Save the Children, UNHCR, are not voicing your concerns a little bit louder. That is the first question. The second question is, I'm a little bit concerned about, it's connected with the second question, is it I am going to think about taking greater role in protecting these human and civil rights of people on the move, because if you are not going to do it, who will? I mean, it's a very, there's only a handful of organizations who is working with these people in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And my last question is a personal question that I want to ask, and maybe a little bit put your focus on it. Maybe you are aware and you are not aware, but the humanitarian conditions, standards in the camps are deteriorating because of the people who are coming in. Of course, you are accepting people so they don't sleep on the street, but that is also creating this humanitarian standard gap, that the standards are going way down. So I'm just asking, do you have some kind of idea about that? And if you're not familiar with it, I just want to, in their names, to point your attention. And Tuzla, I also want to speak about Tuzla, and because we still have more than 100 people on the streets. We still have more than, I mean, comparing to Unasana canton, it's not a huge number, but we have these 100 and more people on the streets. We have more than 200 people in private accommodations. Our safe houses are also full. So yeah, these are also, what is your idea about this? Yes, and I also wanted, my final question, I didn't have time to write it down, is this integration, integration local community project fund that you were call for, and it's been stopped because of this coronavirus outbreak. I was just wondering, are you planning to continue with the process of grant making in the near future? I will just quickly say goodbye to this guy, and I'm right back. I'm hearing you.
You want me to answer immediately?
Yeah, we can go with the answers for the questions, as he said that he can hear us.
Okay, good. Well, first of all, let me take the questions in order on the statements of the Minister of Security. I mean, there are two things that I want to say on this. First, I've been long enough in Bosnia and Herzegovina to sometimes not to pay too much attention on wild public statements of senior politicians. And I don't want to sound disrespectful, because I have a lot of respect for some politicians, but I think, you know, there are political reasons why people make certain stance. And I think, I try, as IOM, and that's not an excuse, you're in a difficult space, if I can put it in those terms. On the one hand, all these centers that are out there, they can only be there if you have a reasonable collaboration with the minister and the Ministry of Security, because they are responsible for this. So you have this, you try to preserve the humanitarian space to operate in. On the other hand, you have positions that are taken that you don't necessarily agree in, and you have to pick your battles, and also you have to pick the means of your battle. It's not, if you want to change a position of a minister or an authority, in my experience, especially I think in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but in many countries, the most effective way is not always to publicly talk. I mean, I can go now to the media and create, a counter narrative and say something entirely different, and then the media will present it. Peter is fighting with the Minister of Security. It may be cool for my image, and I'll get some people saying, "Oh, that's great that someone is standing up." But in terms of actually making change, it may not be the best way of doing it. I'm not trying to. I'm not afraid to make political statements or public statements if things go wrong, but I have to be very careful, on the one hand, to preserve the humanitarian space where we can protect migrants, and on the other hand, I also have to think about what is the most effective way to avoid things going the wrong way, for example. So that's maybe sometimes why, and I can see the frustration, like, well, why isn't IOM speaking up more on certain issues, and on other issues maybe we do, but that's an explanation. It's a sort of it's a delicate game, but I think that we are, of course, discussing with the colleagues in the UN here and OSCE and the Council of Europe on some of those recent statements and what is the best response from our side publicly. That is something that we're certainly working on, and I know that that's maybe not, it's not going to maybe convince you that this is the right way. Maybe we're too slow, but that doesn't mean that we don't work on it. On the forced returns, on deporting people back, I explained earlier, the difficulties of that. Even let's for the time being, let's put the rights issue. It is clear that people can only be deported either if they say, I don't want to apply for asylum, or if they have applied for asylum and they get a negative decision. These are the only two circumstances in which, from a legal perspective, Bosnia has international legal obligations. It's not I'm who's saying that, it's Bosnia who signed up on the international convention. So these are the only two scenarios. But leave that even aside. Just as I said earlier, people have no documents. How do you do that? It's not as simple as it sounds. So we have to see how that plays out. The asylum process in Bosnia, it's a long-standing problem. I agree that there is no effective access. It's too slow. It takes a long time for people to get interviews. To be honest, after 20 years of international support, specifically from the colleagues from UNHCR, the UN agency that is in charge of the refugees and that supports the asylum services, I had a conversation yesterday with the Swedish ambassador about the asylum process. And I say, okay, if the idea is to give more equipment and more capacity building, that's really useless. If I would be a donor, I don't want to go there anymore. After 20 years, I do not understand. And I've said this publicly. I do not understand why this is not working. That comes down to an issue of political will, in my perspective. It's not my mandate, so I'm reluctant sometimes to engage on this. I don't want to jump ahead of the colleagues, but I agree with your question. Asylum is not working, and it needs to work. It can be fast-tracked. You can have a system like you have in Europe. If you're from Pakistan, the chances that you are a refugee is obviously less likely than when you come from Syria. We can all agree on that. I also agree that some Pakistanis may actually have an individual claim. For example, people that are men that are gay, for example, they may have a valid claim for asylum here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But you can have an accelerated procedure where you say, if you're from Pakistan, we'll quickly identify if there is nothing credible in your story that suggests that you are a refugee, we will give you a negative decision. No problem, but you need to deal with this process in a way. In terms of Tuzla, in terms of the humanitarian conditions in camps, I agree with you. The problem is in the camps. Let me give the example of Miral. We designed Miral in Velika Kladuša for 700 people. It's a very small space. You know, it's a former, it's not like Blažu where you have a lot of space. We have 1,200 people there. It is a catastrophe to manage. The standards are going down. Now, the choice that you have is this. You say, we want to preserve the standards. Okay, fine. I will throw 500 people out. What are these people going? This was an issue already before Corona. So you're condemning people to going and live in squats. So you don't do that. Maybe mistakenly so. Maybe I should have said, okay, fine. 700 people, 500 people outside, it's not my problem. It's a problem of the authorities. If you don't create additional accommodation, you're going to have people sleeping outside. Not my problem. My problem is people inside the centers, and I want to preserve. So you play this balancing game. I think in Miral, we were too lenient. We should have probably restricted the numbers more and said to the police, you want to bring people here, you can bring as many as you like, they stay in front of the gate. But it's difficult to do because you know, as you just had your guy in Tuzla, that if I say no, no shower, no food, no access to health. So I agree. And hopefully we have now this new center in Lipa. Maybe that will provide a solution for some people. And I'm hoping still and advocating behind the scenes to get an additional camp or center in Velika Kladuša. But you know from Tuzla how difficult it is. I went to your mayor in Tuzla 2 times and I said, listen, the only thing that you need to, Tuzla is a big city, very few migrants, not really a problem in any normal situation. So I asked him, I begged him, give me a space. Outside the city, it's okay, I can live with that. I will put my staff, we will work with the volunteers, medical services, we have the money, and so that people can sleep there. A place for 300-400 people, more is not needed. It's refused. And so instead, it's a problem for the migrants, but also for the local population, because then when they go and take a bus or the train, they have to step over 100 people that are sleeping in horrible conditions in the bus. And this is totally avoidable. I don't even understand it from a political perspective. If I would be the mayor of a town and someone comes and says, I can help you, and you can be the big guy in the news saying, I'm the one who resolved the problem, nothing happened. So it's very difficult. And I went public. I gave an interview. I mean, if I can put it in those terms, I attacked the mayor on the news and it was a big thing, but nothing changed. So it also shows that being public doesn't always helps, I suppose. That sort of, I think it covers more or less, you know, where we are. Just on the re-registration, the 15 days, it doesn't happen outside, but in the centers, people are still re-registered, the ones that are in the official centers. But that makes the situation of the ones outside the centers just even more complicated.
Thank you so much. As we have some more of the questions, we will be, I'm actually asking other participants to maybe be more concrete, concise. And this topic that we are about to open right now is the thing that also I'm interested in and would be one of my questions on the beginning, but we were actually really in this serious issues and the topic. So I'm gonna ask Yasmina to jump in here and to address with a question. Yes, Yasmina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Milos. And hello to everybody. Thank you, Peter, for sharing your time with us as well. So I have a question, and it's regarding the cooperation with local authorities. So you already started to talk about it a bit. And I'm really curious to hear a bit more, like how local authorities react and what kind of issues they deal with and how do you cooperate with them. And from one side, and then from the other side, I'm really interested to hear if you already established like a cooperation with like NGOs that are working especially in the field of human rights in Bosnia. Do they help? Do they do something? Do you cooperate with them? And especially if there is some youth NGOs that are giving a help and giving a hand, and that you are helping too as well. That's my question. Thank you.
Sure. On the local authorities, obviously, I mean, they're sort of the critical actor in all of this, because you know how Bosnia and Herzegovina functions. It's one thing what happens at the state level, what happens on the ground is often something quite different. It took me a while to understand that if I will not name any names, but some mayors seem to think that they are like the prime minister and they can decide on anything in the municipality. Even if the states decide something entirely different, they have their own rules. And so you have to work with local politicians. The health services, for example, are all at the canton level. They've been doing a fantastic job in Unasana Canton and in Sarajevo. And we have great collaboration with them. Local authorities, it really depends. You have some really good people in the system. I have discovered, for example, amongst legal guardians, people that are in charge of unaccompanied minors, in Unasana Canton, people that are civil servants who are paid very little, frankly, who are often working in very difficult services or doing a fantastic job. Really amazing. We have people that at 2 o'clock in the morning, if I call them, they come to help a mine, not a problem. I've also encountered people that will do anything but their job. So the challenge is, how do you find the good actors and how can you support them? And then, of course, you get involved in local politics. I'm not a politician and I don't get involved in politics per se, but you have to understand, I have to understand, let me put it in this way. I have to understand the details of local politics in Unasana Canton, who is aligned to who knows who, what are the dynamics, who has an interest in what, to be able to operate at the local level. So you become, even though my mandate is humanitarian and I have no preferences politically speaking, you become a political actor in the sense that whatever I do is translated into something political. So you really have to understand the power dynamics in these local communities to be able to operate. And that's how we do. I meet with local authorities all the time, and you negotiate and you try to support the people that are helping you. You try to, if people are blocking, you try to go around them. You try to play party connections that you know of. So that's how we work with local authorities. But overall, I would have to say that the collaboration has been quite positive. If it asks me overall, in a scale from 0 is negative, 100 positive, I would say somewhere around 70, 75, which I think is quite high in a subject that is so complicated. NGOs, human rights NGOs, local groups. Yes, we have a lot of, for example, in Sarajevo, we've been working very closely with Pomozi Ba, which is a great organization, a local NGO. We've been supporting some volunteer organizations like in Tuzla, for example. We have local youth organizations that organize activities for migrants with whom we work with. The colleague from Tuzla mentioned these community projects grants that we will issue. We have had to not stop the process a little bit. We will restart the process and hopefully we'll start issuing grants, which is exactly towards small local initiatives from young people and other people, of course, to work with migrants and to support us in the work. So we have quite a strong network of local organizations that we work with in Bosnia and Herzegovina in different locations. But the critical thing for me is this, and I have to say this because local volunteers are great, and I have some fantastic people, but people have to be very clear. If you want to do humanitarian assistance, you do it non-political. If you are an activist who believes that the EU should not have any borders, and you are part of the no border movement, I respect you as a political activist. But then you cannot be a partner for humanitarian assistance because these are two different things. You cannot use migrants living in bad conditions to criticize the EU for their horrible border policies. There is a need for activism, absolutely. And whatever activism it is, I think it's a great thing for Bosnia and Herzegovina and for democracies generally. But if you want to be involved in humanitarian assistance, you have to be non-political, because otherwise it doesn't work. Because then you start mixing the two things. So that's. But generally there's a lot of associations that we work with.
Yeah. Also, Cerebra is kind of one of them that is cooperating and working with the IOM mission on the ground and on the field. And I know that Youth Council of Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where is Jasmina, is also cooperating within the BIHRI project together with other umbrella youth organizations in our country. And also the support that we are getting is really significant because I think there is a lot of power and energy in the young people here. but there is for sure a lack of support for all of their ideas and initiatives, and any kind of support on the ground is more than significant. I would move on now with Tamara Cvetkovic. She is a member of our organization, and she also has a question. And slowly to take this conversation shorter, because we are a bit out of time right now. Tamara, the floor is yours, and after that we're going to have some closure remarks. Tamara.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Peter, for your very great answers, if I can say like that. I'm a current student on a master for human rights and conflict management in Italy. And we are challenging also now a big problem with approach of European Union when we speak about current problem on the border between Greece and Turkey. And also, I would like to know, do you know the number of women and children in the camps throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina? And do you think, as a peace builder, youth worker, in our country, we are still under the media's propaganda, unfortunately. And I think that it's a very strong violation of human rights all around on both sides, as for migrants, as for the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I would like to know, do you have any long-term plan for Bosnia and Herzegovina? In a way, do we can together create some systematic approach for all of them? And do you think it's not possible in this moment now, especially after COVID-19? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I was worried that you were going to ask me whether I had an overall plan for Bosnia and Herzegovina as a country.
No, it's very complex.
Okay, let me start with the last part. To the extent that it's about migration specifically, and let's say specifically inward migration, this transit migration, I don't know whether Bosnia and Herzegovina needs a long-term plan beyond making sure that it has the capacity to continue this type of transit migration. Because the reality is that migrants do not want to stay here. You're going to probably, after all these 60,000 something people, let's say that at the end of the year we will have had 80,000 in 3 years. My guess is that if you have 100 people or 150 people that will eventually decide to settle here, it's going to be a lot. Which in a way maybe actually I think is a pity, because frankly, I know in Unasana Canton that there are a lot of companies, or we'll see now after Corona, are struggling to get workers, for example, because people from Unasana Canton, they definitely don't want to work in Unasana Canton. They want to work in Croatia, Germany, Slovenia, whatever it is, but not in Unasana Canton. So we have construction companies who can't, and again, this was before Corona, who could not work or apply for our tenders because they didn't have workers. So it would be interesting for Bosnia and Herzegovina to start having a discussion, which I will definitely not launch because then I will be chased out of the country, about how are you going to deal with the lack in your labor market? Because frankly, I sometimes really wonder where these unemployment figures come from, if you look actually what's happening on the ground. And you know, there's a long explanation on that, but there needs to be a discussion in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Western Balkans. How are you going to deal with the exodus of people from this country? How? What exactly is the plan there? And that is where migration needs to play some role. If I launch this today publicly in the press, this will probably be the last time you will see me anywhere in the press, and I will probably be on the first plane back to Belgium. But the serious point there is that is something that needs to be discussed. It may not be that the migrants that are here transiting, they might not be the profile of migrants that Bosnia and Herzegovina needs, different discussion. But that needs to be part of a longer term plan, which is connected to conditions for people to stay here. But that's probably, we could have a long other coffee on this issue. But one thing that I do want to say on that, we have quite, and that's outside the migration, we have a number of different programs where we support local youth initiatives, formal groups, informal groups, small grant programs. The reason why I'm doing this is because I strongly believe two things. First, The problem in Bosnia and Herzegovina amongst youth is not that people are passive. It's not that they're somehow not informed. It is that the conditions are not there for people to actually use their talents and to actually make change in their own local communities. That's, for me, the first component. The second component why we are doing these programs is because I believe that longer term, the only way for the country to change, and it's very easy for me to say because I didn't say in my own country, is for young people and other people to stay and to be local activists and to engage in local politics that are very different from the politics that are there today and that are geared towards actually delivering services to the people, if I can put it so in these very simplistic terms. I know it's a very complex process, but that is why, as IOM, outside this migration response, I try to get as much money as I can, I'll be blunt about it, from donors to do that type of work, because that for me is the longer term, it's the only longer term way or it's part of the longer term way forward for the country. After that little speech, if I may, on the very practical question, 80% roughly of the migrants in Bosnia and Herzegovina are single males. The remaining 20% are families with children. Probably the percentage of women is very low. It's about, I would say, I would have to look at the latest figure, but around, let's say about 10%, if that 10 to 15% maximum of the migrants that are currently here are either women or girls in that way. Just one final point on the human rights issue. I have to say, and in Tuzla it's interesting, maybe it's a separate conversation, but migrants generally feel that until Corona at least, the authorities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the security agencies, the police, border police, treated them actually with respect and dignity, mostly. There's been some small incidents, I'm not saying that, but there's nothing been like the structural violence that you have seen at the Croatian side of the border. And I think when we talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina and about the institutions, let's not forget about that. That really shows to me that there is a shared, amongst the police, border police, we can criticize. And there are things that have happened that shouldn't have happened. Sometimes, excessive use of force by some police agents. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but structurally, it hasn't happened. And that's not me that is saying, that's the migrants that are saying. That's really something to cherish, I think, and to realize that in some European Union countries, it's not like that. So that's my final point.
Thank you so much. As I could have mentioned, even though you're not actually originally from here, I can see that you really understand the whole situation on the ground on a really clear and exact way. On the end of this conversation and discussion, I would give floor to my fellow colleague and friend, same name as me, Milos. He is our president of governing board to address all of you and to say a few words as a closure.
Yeah, thank you, Milos. Once again, Mr. Peter, thank you for being with us and for this opportunity to speak with you about any kind of questions. Before I ask question, I would like to use this opportunity on behalf of the youth sector in Banja Luka and NGO sector, and also on behalf of administration of our city Banja Luka to thank you for the IOM donation for sanation roof of youth center in Banja Luka. I know that it's not published yet, but they told me that I must to thank you. Maybe after this COVID-19 situation, it's going to be some kind of opening, something like that. And also, I think later it is going to be opportunity to join us and come to Banja Luka, to youth centers and have coffee in the face of the place, yeah, in light. Okay, my question is a little bit not so serious as migrants, but it's also connected to the migrations. Youth on the move or young people from villages and from area which is not so developed are coming to the urban area, and it is also one kind of migrations. Do you have some kind of proposals or best best practices from the other countries where IOM has missions. What we can do, what youth organizations and what NGO sector can do to, how to say, stop or I don't know, to stop moving young people from area, from the villages and to the cities, like maybe giving them opportunities and I don't know, to stay, to help them to stay at the villages and do some business or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say that, and that may not sound like a very uplifting answer, I think that this move from villages to cities is very difficult to stop. My sense is that once that starts as a social dynamics, from the countries that I've worked in, it is very difficult to stop. You can maybe, but very often you have that movement and eventually people start returning. That happens as well, but that can take quite some time. But I think what you can do is, first of all, and that's not up to you, you need to have, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's a reality, a decent internet connection in those villages. If you want young people to stay, if you don't have decent Wi-Fi, if you don't have decent 4G, listen, I was in India a couple of months ago. I was in the middle of nowhere. I had 4G in a small village on my phone. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, I go outside Sarajevo and I'm struggling with 3G. And that's not related to the youth, but it's really something where I think you could put pressure on your politicians to deliver that. Because if you want to stay in villages, that's the prime condition nowadays. Secondly, I think create space for political participation. Small villages are quite good in the sense that you don't need a lot of people to make change on the ground. And I think if you can bring local youth into political, doesn't have to be party politics, but into decision-making processes of how to change and improve communities, I think that then people get a stake. If they can help, we've seen this with some of the youth groups that we work with. If young people can create a space, a public space for youth, for example, they have a stake in their village and are more likely to stay, I think. And connecting them, maybe as a final point, connecting them to employment possibilities that don't necessarily require moving. There's a lot of employment opportunities nowadays where people can stay where they are and work remotely. That's maybe a smaller thing, but I think these two things, the Wi-Fi, the internet thing is critical, but create space for young people to participate in how their community will look like. And then of course, basic infrastructure, okay, gym or whatever, fine. But that I think this sense of creating a sense of ownership and sitting down with young people and explaining also, if you move to Sarajevo, let's say, or to Banja Luka, that type of ownership you will never have. That will be a much smaller group of people. If you work in a small village, you can actually be one of the people that makes that village into something that is different from other places, because that village has that type of dynamic. So I think there's some promise in that, in getting the kids involved in that. But it's a difficult process, that I agree with you.
It's
for
basically
sure. I think
making opportunities for the young people. Yeah.
For sure. I think we opened actually a lot of questions, but unfortunately we are out of time right now. And it can be a great opportunity maybe to ask you once again in front of the group to come and visit us sometimes when this situation with COVID-19 ends, and to have some kind of conversation and discussion in person in our wonderful city that celebrated 75th anniversary of liberation in the Second World War yesterday. Once again, thank you so much for helping youth and young people in this country to reach their potential throughout the cooperation with USAID program Bosnia-Herzegovina Resilience Initiative. It is really a pleasure of implementing those grants and programs in our community and communities around Banja Luka. Thank you, Mr. Alverer, so much for your time and for all of your detailed answers here. I really want to thank all of the group that was with us, and congrats to you once again for becoming our Coffee with champion in a manner of number of participants of the conversation. The tradition is actually continuing, and all of us can notice and see that all of our guests in these sessions are really open-minded and relaxed and really enjoying in these discussions. For that, I have to say that in a good company, as we like to say here, time passes really fast. The same situation is right now. I really want to thank you again, and I would ask all of you to follow all of our channels. In next days, we are going to announce more of our guests, and feel free to join us also on next sessions. We are available for any kind of support and help and cooperation in the future, and we really do look forward for that opportunity. Thank you so much for your time again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. This will be all for today's edition of Coffee With. As I said, have a nice day, and hope to see you soon somewhere else out there. Thank you.